temptation. Now, maybe you've heard the expression, opportunity knocks. Well, temptation is always about an opportunity, and it's always going to knock at your door. The question is, will you be ready for it? Will you expect it? Will you know when it's going to come up on your doorstep? Now, temptation alone isn't sin, but it's what we do with the opportunity that determines whether or not it's going to become sin. So just in a recap, strategy number 1 is to request help in advance of temptation. Now let's look at strategy number 2. Just this, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Say that again. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Now, if you've been a Christian for a while, you might have heard this before. But honestly, I used to laugh at this principle, because this isn't the first time I've heard it. I've laughed at it because actually it's based on a verse in the book of James. But I would laugh at that because I would think, oh man, easier said than done. Resist the devil, that's a nice thought, but how could we ever tangibly do this? But the truth is, Scripture really means what it says when it comes to that verse. So it really begs our attention. We need to give it some careful thought and look at that. So let's turn to James chapter 4, verse 7. James chapter 4, verse 7 reads this: "Submit yourselves, therefore, to God, and resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Pretty plain, pretty clear and cut right here. Resist the devil, he will flee from you. And this word to resist, it means to stand against, or to withstand, to hold your ground. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but back in the 1980s, First Lady Nancy Reagan was instrumental in starting a campaign that was widely spread in most schools called Just Say No. In the 1980s, there was kind of a crisis, the war on drugs, and the Reagan administration was really big on attacking the war on drugs. And so they came up with this pretty catchy slogan that was then turned into an education program called Just Say No. Now, even though there are always groups of teenagers or people that would laugh at that or think it's corny, the truth is, after 30 years later, it's still going. Like 30 years, 3 decades, people are still, they're quite familiar with that phrase. The DARE program was instituted in the state of Missouri, and most of us grew up with this kind of an education. And so, sure, it might be a little corny, but man, it's also brilliant because it was simple and it was a really sticky phrase, just say no. And what made this campaign so brilliant, this war against drugs, just say no, is that it empowered an adolescent to use a tool that was already well at their disposal. It was already something they already had in their tool belt that most teenagers mastered, and that tool is rebellion. See, the Reagan administration helped teenagers learn how to leverage their rebellion constructively. And it really actually made a difference in the long haul. Now, if we're going back to not the war on drugs, but the war on temptation, I have heard countless people, and myself included, read James 4:7 and shrug it off because, well, it's just easier said than done. Who could really resist the devil? And maybe I just need to learn to leverage a tool that I already have in my tool belt, and that's rebellion. Because if there's one thing that mankind has mastered really well, it's rebellion. And here's what's interesting. This word resist that's found in James 4:7 is actually used in other situations in Scripture too, that exact word. In fact, if you were to look at Romans 13, it talks about resisting authority. Now, I'm pretty sure most of us have at some point in our lives resisted authority. In Acts chapter 6 or 2 Timothy 3, it speaks about people who have resisted God's truth. And I'm pretty sure we at some point have resisted God's logic or his intervention. But then you read in Ephesians chapter 6, and Paul tells us to put on the armor of God, and that's at our disposal. And then he even tells us to go confidently and resist the devil. Why? Because our weapons far outweigh our enemy's weapons. Temptation becomes defeatable when we learn to leverage our skill of rebellion. And with the power of Christ and the armor of God, we can confidently say no to the devil's schemes. To make matters even better for us, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, says this: "No temptation," look at this, "no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear." Now, this word overtaken, it means to actively lay hold of or to seize. He's saying there's no temptation that has ever just seized you, ravished you. You can actually fight against it. This is what he says here. "But when you are tempted, he," meaning God, "will also provide a way out." He will provide a way out. This is fascinating for us, church. This is groundbreaking for us. Now, each week we try to give you a shareable, something you can put on Twitter, social media, Facebook, wherever. Maybe you could text it out to a friend or even put it as an email, that every temptation is escapable. Every temptation is escapable. Hashtag Jesus saves. And it's our prayer that these shareable moments would plant seeds just digitally, virtually, and to see them go far out, and you never know what God is capable of doing. So if you would post that, we really appreciate it. Because here's the truth. Temptation becomes defeatable when we learn to leverage our skills of rebellion, when we learn to say no constructively. So just a quick recap. Strategy number 2 is to resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Now let's take a look at strategy number 3. Strategy number 3 is this: retreat from certain kinds of temptation. You want to retreat from certain kinds of temptation. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that seems kind of odd. You just said, let's resist the devil and he'll flee from us. So why do we need to retreat? Well, yeah, we can resist the devil, but there are some temptations, according to Scripture, that it's just wiser to take off. Now, we're not running from the devil, but we are running from maybe a weapon that he's using. Because the truth is, most people just can't stand under that kind of spiritual pressure. And where we get this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14 reads, "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry." Flee from idolatry. And actually, in Corinthians, they had really struggled with a lot of sin issues. And this word comes up that's really specific. And in the Greek, this word flee, it means flee. Like, if you could attach a name to it, it would be Usain Bolt and just take off. It's not worth the fight. Get out of here. You're not going to make it. You need to run, okay? Run for the hills. Be Forrest Gump. Get out of here. You get the idea. But this word flee, it actually comes up several more times with specific types of temptation. In fact, it's in 1 Corinthians 6:18. It says this: flee from sexual immorality. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22 says, flee from the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 10 through 11 says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, flee from all of this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. So the specific word flee comes up in these specific instances, and we need to pay attention to that. Now, it's not the same word, but it's a similar word that's used in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, that reads, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Now, this word, abstain, it's not the same Greek word as flee, but it does mean to hold back, to keep away, or to maintain your distance. So you're starting to pick up on this idea that there are certain kinds of temptation that, man, it's just not worth the fight. We're not going to win in those specific battles. In fact, it would be better to flank, to move around. And you know, in combat, actually fighting head on is a strategy needed sometimes, or to do what's called a blitz and just come in heavy. That's needed sometimes. But other times, it's actually more strategic to go around the enemy, or to flank them, or to keep your distance. And the same is used here, to abstain. And these passages really give us a key strategy. When certain temptations come knocking at the door, don't be like what the victims do in horror movies and they run upstairs or they hide in the basement. No, you need to get out of the house. Like, take off. Like, don't be there when the killer's in the house with you. Go. So if the temptation of certain one knocks at your door, it might be a better strategy to actually take off running. I love this quote by Mark Twain. He says this: there are several good protections against temptation, but the surest is cowardice. Some temptations just aren't worth the fight. You have to get up and go. And I think really the best story or the best example that epitomizes this idea of running away from a temptation is found in Genesis chapter 39, the story of a guy named Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now, Joseph, if you recall, maybe you've heard the story, maybe you haven't, he was actually a slave. But over the years, he had worked his way up. Now, he was wrongfully slaved. He had a tough life, a bum situation. But here he was working for this guy named Potiphar. And he started eventually working his way up the ranks and became not just a slave, he became this guy's right-hand man. This is a position of privilege and prestige, okay? Prestigiousness, or however that word is, but pristine position, okay? So here he was. But he had a problem. See, Joseph was actually a pretty well-built and good-looking guy, and he caught the eye of Potiphar's wife. And I'm telling you, day in through day out, he would receive an offer from Potiphar's wife behind Potiphar's back to come to bed with him. And Joseph, being an upstanding good guy, man of integrity was, day after day resisted. And I want you to read this with me. This is Genesis chapter 39. We're going to pick up here. Verse 6 says, Joseph was well-built and handsome. It's a bummer to be him, right? Okay. But verse 7, it says this, after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Man, this woman is forward. I mean, she is a total seductress. This is a really rough situation for him. But look at verse 8. He refused. If you look at verse 9, it says, he even responded to her in one such conversation and said, how could I do such a wicked thing and an evil sin against God? He already said, I don't want to hurt Potiphar, but why would I even want to do this against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So he is practicing the utmost integrity, and he's taken a flank position, right? He's keeping his distance. But one day, verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. And there, Potiphar's wife, she caught him by his cloak. Man, she came in and she grabbed him, caught him by his cloak, and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and he ran out of the house. Okay, this is not just a good moment. This is a heroic moment. We should cheer and celebrate his kind of integrity in this moment. The example that he sets, it couldn't have been more aggressive of a situation. Temptation is not just knocking at his door. It's trying to grab a hold of him, okay, and drag him into the room. And he flees. And this word for ran, it means to flee, to escape. And that's where we get strategy number 3, that we need to retreat from certain kinds of temptation. Let me just ask you, have you ever felt the pressure of lingering temptation in your life? Have you ever felt like maybe sometimes it does not just knock on your door, but knock on your shoulder? It's always usually when we're alone, when we're hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Man, it comes, and it comes fierce. Have you tried running? Do you have your running shoes ready to go? Are you ready to bolt? Strategy number 3, retreat from certain kinds of temptation. Okay, let's move on to strategy number 4. Strategy number 4, and that is to remove any means of sin far from your life. You want to actually remove any means of sin far from your life. You want to cut off any ties. You want to get rid of anything. You want to do a total and complete quarantine in your life. Now, let's be honest though. This is where most people tend to struggle. This is where most people tend to actually fall short. This is where most of us go, okay, I can ask for help. I can even flee sometimes, but I don't know if I'm ready to actually remove everything out of my life. I don't know who said this quote, but man, it stuck with me. It just reads, temptation usually comes through a door that has deliberately been left open. I'm going to read that again. Temptation usually comes through a door that has deliberately been left open. Now, I can't speak for you, but I can tell you that this quote has been true for my life. Like, usually the sins I've committed have come because of my refusal to fully close the door. I've left just a big enough crack in there just in case I ever want to return. I don't have to fully open the door. It's already partially open for me. That way I can just push it on in. Not a big deal at all. I can peek in anytime I want. But instead of closing the door, locking it off, and then fleeing from the house, I leave the door just slightly cracked open. My guess is that maybe you've done the same thing too. Maybe you've experienced just kind of leaving the door available, cracked open, in case you ever need to come back into that room. Proverbs chapter 4, verses 14 through 15 really gives some wise insight, but also some really encouraging advice.